last week, you may have noticed in our weekly e-news, Kristen's been putting out a poll for you all to answer. And last week's poll was, if you were a pastor, would you prefer to officiate a funeral or a wedding? Exactly, totally. That's where I'm at too. I would totally do a funeral, and that seems to be where the bulk of the answers were. That many of you said, I would prefer to do a funeral. One of you said a wedding, and weddings are delightful. Don't get me wrong, and yet there's just a lot put into weddings. There's that emotional investment. There's that this has to be the most perfect day ever. And then you throw in some family drama, and then it can crash and crumble pretty quickly. It really didn't need to. So with that said, as we gather and celebrate weddings, though, there's one thing that I do require of a wedding, and that is to do premarital counseling. And premarital counseling often gets a bad rap. It becomes this kind of, oh my gosh, it's a compatibility test. The pastors can become this judgment person, and is this going to be a legitimate wedding, and all kinds of stuff is thrown in the midst of it, when really it can be a lovely conversation. Through my ministry, though, there have been some sticky conversations. I've only had to ask one couple, are you sure you want to do this? I've had another couple just blatantly lie to me, and I'm like, whoa! So we had to flesh that out a little bit. But overall, they're great conversations. And why? It's because people like to talk about meaningful conversations or meaningful relationships. Who doesn't like to talk about either a meaningful relationship with a person that you love or with a friendship? They give us joy. So why not talk about them? Because ultimately we have great conversations. One question, though, that I ask of couples when we gather together is, what from your family of origin do you want to keep and or continue in your relationship? And what do you want to leave at the front door? This can pertain to anything. Family rituals, disciplining children, food choices, chore lists, and who does what, all the way to, will you practice a faith tradition? And if you decide to have children, how will you raise the children, and in what faith tradition? It's a question that bridges autonomy of the couple and what gets passed on from generation to generation. That same question can be applied even outside of the realm of premarital counseling. What from your family origin have you held on to that helps you make meaning each and every day? And what are those items that you have just simply shed? In the second letter to Timothy, the person claiming to be Paul is writing his farewell discourse. Regardless of who the actual author is, this person, whom I will just call Paul for simplicity's sake, is writing from a Roman prison and is not likely to be released. Since Paul is captive to his thoughts in this cell, he takes this moment to testify to the gospel, to the Holy Spirit who kindled faith in our ancestors and then rekindled that same sincere and powerful faith in us. Paul appeals to Timothy to continue this proclamation and to keep the gospel unfolding. In this letter, Paul is heartfelt as he continues to build relationships with those outside the prison walls. He laments many things: followers who have deserted him, his awareness of ongoing conflict between the Christ-following communities, and his knowledge of people turning away from the faith. Yet, despite such sorrows, Paul demonstrates remarkable calm in the face of impending death, affirming his calling as an apostle in the church to rekindle his faith by trusting and relying on the spiritual heritage gifted to him by his biological family, his mother and his grandmother, and by his family of faith, Paul. As if faith is summoning Paul to to share this reminder with Timothy, who will then share this gospel message with everyone else. What gets passed down from the ages? Faith grows in community. One generation passes the knowledge of God's grace on to the next, and a faithful community both remembers its heritage and considers its future legacy. As we reflect on the good treasure of faith, we consider, how can our faith lead us to hope when we find ourselves in a strange land? Who has led and encouraged us in our faith? How are we passing on our spiritual legacy? As we gear up for our visioning process, I suspect one of our questions will be, who do we pass this to? The gospel message, our heritage, our story of Hazel Park UCC. When we physically do not see butts in the pews and we are trying to make sense of online realities, where do we see the young people? Where do we even see our young adults and our families? Anyone? Where is everyone? Last week, or was it a week and a half ago, the Minnesota Conference UCC hosted a fourth Thursday event. At this event, we heard from Josh Packard, a researcher from Springtide Research Institute that focuses on Generation Z, those between the ages of 13 and 25. And Dr. Packard shared some insight with us about this generation. I'm looking at you. And I think he also gave me some awareness that transcends just Generation Z. If we desire this generation to come participate in church life again, we should not expect them to come back to church. This generation was not necessarily here in the first place. And why? We look to their parents. Their parents, Gen Xers, my generation, have a love-hate relationship with organized institutions. And the church, religion, is a part of that. There's a level of distrust. There's a level of, why would we do that? There's a level of questioning. So these younger generations, the X, Y, Z, and even now Alpha, will need to be connected again. The stories that Paul wants Timothy to share and pass down through the generations have been passed down to us and have not been necessarily passed down to the younger generations. Snippets of the story have been, and that's not a slight toward you or me in sharing these stories the best that we can. It's how culture is moving. So instead of saying, why aren't they coming, we need to start reintroducing ourselves all over again, and to build up a level of trust that was not there to begin with. The younger generations are filling in gaps about church experience as they hear from their trusted adults and online research. And let's face it, some adults are pretty jaded about faith. And some online research tools can share some pretty harmful information about faith. Generation Z can run circles around us in the digital community. Their voices ring loud in the arenas of social justice. We have much to learn from them, and we have much to learn together and to share with them. A faith story that summons us to encompass more and look beyond our walls. We can share about the deeply covenantal relationships of faith, and when our faith moves into action, it is powerful as it speaks directly to God's extravagant welcome and love. Faith endures through adversity, as demonstrated by Paul's testimony from prison and the poet of Lamentations who bore witness to the devastation of exile. Faith does not make light of hardship, distress, and suffering, nor does it make light of one's experience within or without a formal church setting. Faith endures and sustains those undergoing times of trial. The second letter to Timothy does not aim to increase our own faith, but to share our faith. To share our faith with others, and to pass on the legacy. As described by Timothy, the treasure of faith is one of power, love, and self-discipline, and contains all that we need to endure the challenges life deals to us. We may well find it easier to focus, like the disciples, on strengthening our own faith than on sharing faith with others. Yet sharing the good news we have learned is an essential part of our call as Christians. What object or symbol might be placed today to help us recall and remember those who have passed on their faith and observe how that faith has sustained us during difficult times? How might we encourage and witness to the love and way of God? You know what this means, right? This means we're going to actually have to talk about our faith, folks. It's a culture that is steeped in our individual growth. Our faith is summoning us to share with others. And in doing so, we cannot be surprised that those who enter our space will be carrying with them their experiences of their traditions, their families of origin, their online research. The generations after us look to other religious backgrounds to make sense of morals and values, not just one and not just Christianity. We live in a pluralistic society, and we have much to learn from each other and much to share to begin trusting each other again. And I believe wholeheartedly that the Christian church is still needed and valued. We just need to get over identifying the Christian church as over and above all others. David White sums up this by saying, "We have lived through a modern era in which the assumption was that right knowledge issued forth right behavior. Here at the far end of modernity, most have come to understand that embodied social practices more effectively change behaviors and make us who we are. We are far more likely to develop good theology if we consistently practice worship, living as community, hospitality to strangers, forgiveness, prayer, seeking justice, or singing. From the ground of these embodied social practices come our theological and ethical issues and ideas. This is the sort of embodied faith that Paul seems to be affirming in this passage. A faith that is lived in families, in social bodies, and across generations in their habits and practices. A faith that suffers, even as Paul did, and does not avoid the messiness of love for others. Such a faith is not primarily compelled by romantic notions of love or random acts of kindness, but by a love that participates with Christ's love." End quote. A love that will not let us go. And why wouldn't we share that? May it be so.